Social media platforms, particularly Facebook, were collecting vast amounts of user data. This data could be analyzed and used to understand and influence user behavior. This was obvious, but largely ignored, and it was easy and convenient to forget as people continued to use those platforms. Then we had a moment for pause. 2018 interviews with The Guardian and the New York Times exposed data collection and misuse from Cambridge Analytica, and this disclosure began a scandal that made the vast data collection from social media platforms like Facebook obvious and too large to ignore. People were angry about how much data Facebook was really collecting and how fast and loose they were being with it. A discussion happened. Facebook was fined $5 billion for privacy violations, but after time, people forgot, and during the entire time, they continued to use Facebook apps like almost nothing really happened. This came to mind when thinking about the F-35 announcement in DCS's 2025 and beyond video. There has been a huge discussion in the community. Some people are very excited for the module, others are infuriated and are saying that DCS is going down the dark path of War Thunder. I do like it when the community gets into a big discussion, and there are some interesting threads to pull on. So today we talk about the F-35, why people are angry, why people should or should not be angry. Then we cover why people should be concerned and why all this doesn't matter. If this is your first time here, this channel focuses on multiplayer sim gameplay. So if you're into that, please subscribe. The surprise in the 2025 and beyond trailer was a real surprise this year because no one expected the F-35 to ever even be attempted in DCS. Usually a module gets announced that we were all waiting for, like the Chinook, but this was a true surprise and it made the reactions that much better. Some people were genuinely angry and people were fast to share it, and I want to break down why quickly because it's a good way to ground the more interesting part of this discussion. Why are people mad? On the surface, people are angry because no one really expects ED to be able to accurately model this thing. ED came out with a justification of how they are going to do it, and I get the sense that no one really bought it. And in general, I do not think I need to even explain why because it's so obvious. ED is very clearly going to use some interpretation or abstraction in the pursuit of modeling this aircraft, and I think that's completely fine. Why I think that will come in part 2, but let us continue why people are raging because it helps to set the table. On a deeper level, there are 2 reasons why people are pissed, and this is where I want to start. The first is that this has shown ED's hand quite a bit, and the facade has been broken a bit. What do I mean by this? If it has not been obvious to you yet, the realism thing was always just a convenient excuse to not model something. What do I mean by this? Think about it. Eagle Dynamics has positioned DCS in the market to be the most realistic combat flight simulator. Realism is the thing that they and the community strives for, and because of this noble pursuit, they have really built a cult-like following with some people. But as we know, realism has its costs. How many times have people pined for electronic warfare in this game, only to have their hands swatted away, and being told that it's too sensitive to model? How many people have asked for Cold War British aircraft from the 1960s and then their request is rejected because the British Ministry of Defense continues to guard those documents as state secrets? There have been countless examples of requested things that, under the guise of realism, have been rejected, and now players are being told a F-35 is coming to DCS. The knee-jerk reaction for some people is to be angry about the inconsistency in the messaging because it is a bit of a bait and switch. The deeper thought, in my opinion, is to realize that the realism label has always just been a convenient excuse to not model something. And in my opinion, that's the thing that's not super obvious but makes this whole announcement really frustrating and why I think people are angry. Second reason why people are angry is a short but a strange one. Remember how I mentioned DCS has a cult-like following? Yeah, there are a non-trivial amount of people who associate very deeply with this game and are real believers in this pursuit of realism. These people didn't see a F-35 announcement. They saw this almost like an attack on their identity, or their game is dropping its standards, and this explains the intensity in their reaction. This to me is the inspiration for the title of this video. This game has always made compromises to make things modeled into the game. It has conveniently ignored some things to not model it. It has used interpretation or abstraction to make some planes possible. It's always been in the game, but not messaged so heavily. Suddenly, one of the key points in the F-35 announcement is the need to interpret and abstract things, and it was all out in the open. A lot of people did not want to look past the facade, but now it's in their face, and that's upsetting to them. So now we know why people are angry. Let's shift gears slightly. Let's talk about why they should not be angry, and also what are some other reasons why people should be angry that may not be so obvious. What has been interesting is that as the DCS community has swept itself up into a frenzy about realism, they have sort of lost sight of what they really want. Put it plainly, people do not want realism. They just want the appearance of realism. And I think this is an interesting thing to think about as we unpack why people should not be angry about this. People like to believe they want one-for-one realism and rage about the F-35's announcement, but are quick to ignore a lot of the other compromises that were made in the past. For example, let us look at the MiG-21. The MiG-21 in DCS is a BIS variant, but it has two weapons that were not compatible with the real-life variant, the H-66 and the ARS-2US. These could only work with an earlier radar that was not present on the BIS. So basically, the MiG-21 we have has a radar that never existed. It's a fusion, so it can allow for more things to be used on it. Is this realistic? No. Is this better for the game and for players? Probably yes. If we are only going to get one variant of the most produced supersonic aircraft in history, then it's probably in our interest that the developers stretch things a bit so we get one that is more representative of the line and not just one of the single variants. This gives the player options when creating missions, and it helps to plug gaps. Look at India Fox Echo. They recently announced they're going to be adding sidewinders to their trainer and the upcoming G91. And people are happy that they are giving the plane some capabilities, because before they were not even going to have missiles. Now these planes will be able to defend themselves in multiplayer. Look at the Eurofighter coming. It was confirmed that they are going to take some liberties to make sure that the module is as feature rich as possible. This is what reasonable people want. In general, it is fine that some sort of abstraction or interpretation is used to get something modeled. It allows for the world to be more fleshed out, and that is what makes this topic so interesting. There is some nuance to this topic. There are good and valid reasons to be fine with this, because it helps to make things viable. Out of all the statements following the F-35 announcement, ironically, the best one about it came from, not from ED, but India Fox Echo, and part of their message is highlighting what I am saying. There are areas in which ED will have to guesstimate, and this is not unique to the F-35. This is a simulation, not real life, and this is the thing that people should really rally around. This point about interpretation or abstraction, by the way, lines up with a video that I previously made in mid-2023. I made a popular video called Full Fidelity is a Trap, and it still gets referenced today because I think it simultaneously struck a chord and a nerve with the community. Bring it back up because I think the entire topic is very applicable to this discussion. Here's how. 1. You can sacrifice a bit on fidelity to allow something to be modeled. This was brought up in the video, and it was enraging to many people. Guess what? This is what DCS has always been doing. You may not have known it or may have been distracted by the marketing, but it's always been doing this. Let me also remind you that as people pound the realism drums, they conveniently forget that 70% of the Russian jets in this game aren't even clickable. This game is very clearly better with compromises. This line of thinking is bringing us to the F-35, and in this case, I think it's fine to add. 2. DCS world needs more aircraft to round out the existing plane set. My hope was that the utilization of interpreting and abstracting things would enrich DCS world and not stretch it even further. The F-35 announcement makes the existing problem worse, not better. In a list of modules that we absolutely did not need in this game, the F-35 is probably somewhere in there. It is crazy to me that the game, populated by a ton of realist purists, are completely fine that one of the most normal matchups in multiplayer is the F-16 versus the F-15. The only other place where this is normal is War Thunder. You would never see P-51s fighting P-47s in IL-2 because that community actually cares about historical accuracy. People will look the other way and pretend these make-believe matchups are not a big deal as long as the right number of rivets exist in their cockpit. This goes back to people not wanting realism, but the appearance of it. This massive skew in the community toward Blue 4 and NATO aircraft is something that, in my opinion, hurts the overall experience. People focus so much on the aircraft that they ignore what's outside of it. So in this particular case, I do think that the F-35 is going to accelerate some of the problems in the game. Modules should enrich the world, not stretch it out even further. 3, I think people ultimately want consistency. What I mentioned in that video is that as modules become more detailed and more modeled, they become more inconsistent with each other, and that is really frustrating. I did not say this as clearly in the video, but I'm going to say it now. Full fidelity is not the answer. Sustainable fidelity is. It is better for everyone that a line in the sand is drawn and ED enforces it. All modules meet the same level of detail or fidelity, and it is sustained as the game changes. It is silly that rules apply to some modules, but not others. An example, the F-35 is going to be introducing stealth because the levels of fidelity are not sustainable in some of the modules. I think it's safe to say that how stealth interacts with all the third-party modules will not really be consistent. These moments when things are introduced should be uniformly applied. So the F-35 announcement, in my opinion, is going to continue to do what the game has always done, which is just add more, but never make it feel cohesive across the ecosystem. I made those points in that video in 2023, and I think they are as relevant then as they are with this F-35 announcement. It's not really about full fidelity or not. It really should be about trying to make the game feel fleshed out and cohesive. I really do think that the majority of people would enjoy it if the game focused more on that instead of just chasing different levels of unsustainable fidelity. What else? What about the third-party module makers? Should they be angry? I took a quick canvas of a handful of third-party module makers, and in some cases, the mood was mixed, but ultimately for everyone, it skewed very positive. Why mix? I think this links back to the point of consistency. Some third-party module makers were a little annoyed that they are being held to a different standard than AD. I think it's a natural reaction if you were a third-party module maker. Imagine trying to make sure that the module that you're working on has a flight model that matches up with the report that you had to struggle to find. And then you hear about the F-35's flight model, which is just going to be sort of vibed out. I think this kind of really highlights one of the nerves that F-35 announcement is touching up on. Some people are probably fine with the abstraction. They just don't want to be gaslit about how it's being modeled. Outside of that, the third-party module makers all brought up the same thing. The F-35 is going to be a huge success, and ED's success is their success, and this should make you all happy. The F-35 will be an absolute goldmine for ED, and this success will benefit everyone. Think about it. How many countries use the F-35? This plane is the fighter in a lot of major markets. Every time a movie comes out featuring F-35, DCS is probably going to see a bump in players. The Hornet was the entry-level plane for a long time, and I would imagine that the F-35 is going to take that spot over time. This is going to be a flagship module that ED is going to anchor themselves around. It also comes at a pretty good time. In 2018, the Hornet came out. In 2019, the F-16. And then in 2022, the Apache came out. These are all flagship modules, but it's been a while since ED has had a release on the same scale. These are all modules that probably really popped off in terms of revenue. ED probably needs the F-35, but the question is, does DCS need it? So some are happy, some are angry, and there are good reasons for either argument, but ultimately this is probably a good business move for DCS. With this all said, there are some things that give me pause, and I'm curious of everyone's thought on this. Let me preface by saying that there is one pleasant topic that needs to be covered. It is not one that I want to give validity to, but I also don't think this topic can be completely covered without acknowledging the existence of one of the most common topics in this F-35 discussion. All throughout last year, very public allegations came out about ED having financing issues. Now, I'm not giving validity to these claims, nor am I agreeing with them. I'm just acknowledging that those allegations exist. Now, what happened in the aftermath of these allegations being hurled? Eagle Dynamics released a lot of underbaked modules like Kola, the Chinook, Afghanistan, Iraq, and then repurposed Mac content for FC 2024, which honestly seemed really random. This, of course, was fuel for the fire for this unproven allegation, and a lot of players use these module releases as data points to build their narrative of assumptions and speculations. Now, again, I'm not saying that ED has financing problems. I'm genuinely not sure on that front, but what I am saying is that I can see why people convince themselves to think that they did, because one of the most common ways for a business to inject revenue is to rely on your brand and release lower quality products. Now, if you subscribe to this theory, the F-35 announcement in some ways sort of feels in line with this narrative. So in some ways, this F-35 announcement can be concerning for some. Not my favorite topic to bring up, but it is one that is very prevalent in the community. The grossly incompetent PR management on this topic has allowed this issue to fester, and I have to now talk about it because it would look odd if I didn't, because it's omnipresent in the community discussion. Another point of concern is also related to the timing of this module. This F-35 module is being announced right after, not too late after Falcon 5 announced that they are coming, and we know the F-35 is coming in that game. Now, I'm not saying that ED is positioning themselves to be aggressive to Falcon 5. That is unknown to me. But what I will say is that DCS tackling the F-35 does immediately step into Falcon 5 territory. We don't know much about the game, but one of the unique things that we did know about it was that it was going to have the F-35. Now, it won't be a point of uniqueness. I tend to think that the simulators try to play nice with each other. I tend to think that most of the people in this scene can take a step back and realize that the success of the niche is the success of all of them. I tend to think that. The issue is that it's not always the case. We have seen with 1C and IL-2 position themselves much more aggressively against the new simulator, Combat Pilot. 1C and IL-2 were avoiding the Pacific for the longest time. Combat Pilot comes around, and then they immediately state that they intend to go into the Pacific. It's disappointing, it's aggressive, and I bring it up to show that it can happen in the scene. So I'm not saying that EDs has to do it on purpose, and also it doesn't really matter because it doesn't have to be intentional. Just the fact that they're going to overlap does take some of the shine away from Falcon 5, and I think it's in our collective interest that each new simulator shines as bright as possible. These are all things that I don't really take joy in bringing up, but I do think they are interesting to think about. Let me know, are these causes for concern for you too, or do you think they're not even worth thinking about? In closing, let me make my own thoughts on the F-35 very clear. I think ultimately, and on the whole, this will be good for the game. It's hugely disappointing that the world is going to be stretched out even further, but this is DCS. Making the world feel cohesive is not really part of the current game plan, so it's not really going to change things all that much. I have a general nervousness of the potential overlap with Falcon 5, but that may just be me being overly nervous, so we will see how that plays out. It's going to be a huge financial success, and I think that's the thing that should keep everyone grounded in this conversation. A success in this niche is a success for everyone. The last thing I do want to mention is that I do think that ED should be willing to publicly embrace the need to abstract and interpret things. The whole marketing around realism has done a really good job of building out an identity for DCS, but the facade of it has really made people focus on all the wrong things. If you aren't convinced about this realism versus interpretation piece, let me share a quote from the Falcon 4 manual. Quote, "When we worked on a low-cost Falcon-based F-16 trainer for the government 10 years ago, a colonel told me that if you asked designers to create a simulator without any compromises, they would end up designing the aircraft itself. The art of simulation design is about understanding limited fidelity. Even in multi-million-dollar simulators, compromises must be made. Designers have to consider cost versus fidelity and processor time versus fidelity. Additional trade-offs must be made between graphics, AI flight models, number of units, and more. The basic rule in building a flight simulator is to never ask the pilot what he wants, because he too will end up building an airplane. Instead, ask the pilot what they need to learn. People have lost the plot. The appearance of realism, the consistency in modeling, and the cohesion in the experience is what ultimately make things feel good. While the F-35 module may not be my favorite one to come to DCS, the thinking that allowed for it may also be applied to some other things that would make the game feel more complete. These other modules which the game has avoided to do. I do think that ED should be encouraged to try to think more holistically and allow themselves to interpret more. Lord knows that modeling things just as they are in real life is not particularly unique anymore. It's not the mid-2000s. Other games and even mod teams are doing it. So in closing, whether you like it or not, the F-35 is coming. I would be really curious to hear from you below. I think the interesting thing about this topic is that people's thoughts on it have seemed to evolve a bit, which is rather unique. Most people stick to their knee-jerk reaction, but I have seen some stances soften. So let me know what you think, and let me know what you think of the video. If you want to help, please subscribe, as that is the best way to help the channel. Thank you and have a good one.